This is part 2 of our 3-part series on Lincoln's America. But before I begin that, happy Thanksgiving, a blessed Thanksgiving, and for our audience as well, a blessed Thanksgiving. And also just one small piece, another piece of history. If you celebrate Thanksgiving, you've really got the wrong holiday. They brought Thanksgiving with them, the Pilgrims did. But Thanksgiving was about fasting and prayer. What they also brought with them was come on, we're just starting, was a harvest festival. And that was about eating. So a harvest festival. And the man who got it wrong, speaking of our segue, the man who got it wrong was Lincoln. Lincoln in November of 1863 designated the last Thursday in November, not the 4th, the last Thursday in November is Thanksgiving. So he's the one that got the holiday wrong. So blame it on the Bossa Nova, or blame it on Abraham Lincoln. And one more thing. When these pilgrims arrived, at the Plymouth colony, they did not come for anyone else's religious freedom but their own. Anybody else need not apply. Catholics keep on going. Everybody else keep on going. It was for their religious freedom. And secondly, the Mayflower Compact, we all remember that, was not the first draft of the Constitution. And thirdly, they came as loyal English subjects. There was no direct line from Plymouth Rock to the Lexington Green. The American Revolution is 8 generations away. By the way, there's no Plymouth Rock either. That was a complete fabrication on the part of the good people of Plymouth to be able to get some tourist trade down there. So they came for their religious freedom. The Mayflower Compact is not the first draft of the Constitution, and they came as loyal English subjects of His Majesty James II. So with that being said, and Lincoln getting it wrong, let's go to the year 1863 again. And the last time we talked, which was last month, wasn't it? Or was it in September? Whatever. I know the last time we talked that we brought Lincoln up through his election, and we brought Lincoln up through his position on slavery, to contain slavery, and the firing of McClellan, in the aftermath of Antietam. And here it is, 1863, clearly a very pivotal year for Lincoln. And, what I'd like to talk about in terms of 1863, 155 years ago, I'd like to chat about the Emancipation Proclamation and what that did and what it did not do. And secondly, the League at Gettysburg and Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. And it's not a speech. It's not an address either. It's Lincoln's epistle, a letter to the Corinthians, if you will, Father Abraham to the people. And then thirdly, as we transition from 1863 to 1864, I'd like to chat about Lincoln's early thinking about Reconstruction. On what terms would the defeated Confederate states, one by one, be allowed back into the Union. So let's see if we can roll that all out this afternoon and save a little bit. I'll keep a little bit back for December, so we can button everything up in December. In January of 1863, actually, let me just back up for one more moment. In the aftermath of the Confederate retreat at Antietam, it was not a Union victory. McClellan called it a Union victory, but he really simply pushed Lee, back into Virginia. That Lincoln had been thinking about issuing the Emancipation Proclamation. And truth to tell, the Emancipation Proclamation did not free a single slave. And when Lincoln issued that Emancipation Proclamation in January of 1863, that January 1st, and that was important for him, it's because he told the leaders of the Confederacy that if you're not back into the Union by January of 1863, with slavery, with slavery, repeal your ordinance of secession and get back into the Union. If you're not in by January of 1863, I am going to issue an Emancipation Proclamation and free every slave in the Confederacy. And of course, for Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederacy, this is impossible. This is civil war. I mean, this is a race war that Lincoln is trying to gin up, if you will, among the slave states. And on January 1, 1863, and this was such a sweet custom, we don't do it today. Could never do it today. And that on January 1, on New Year's Day, the president stood on the gravel driveway in front of the executive mansion. It wasn't the White House yet. Theodore Roosevelt will call it the White House. And that as long as there were people online, and he would shake their hand and wish them a Happy New Year. And they would wish him and his family a Happy New Year as well. Isn't that quaint? And I'll tell you when that ended. It ended with the Great Depression. Herbert Hoover put an end to that. I think he was afraid people want to punch him in the mouth, rather than to shake his hand. So that ended sometime in 1928 or 29 or 30, I'm not sure. But the reason this is part of our story is that Lincoln had invited the cabinet to meet with him that afternoon when he'd finished greeting everybody, and to be present when he signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This is an historic event. And you may want to be able to tell your grandchildren that you saw the president ink the Emancipation Proclamation. And they showed up, and Lincoln was there. And when Lincoln went to pick up the pen to sign the proclamation, it fumbled out of his fingers. And then he picked it up again, and it tumbled out of his fingers again. And people around the table were, looking at each other and noticing this. Is this a sign? Is he nervous? Is he, at the end, is he pulling back? Is he wincing? And the answer is no, that after shaking hundreds, maybe thousands of hands, his fingers were swollen. And he wanted a good, firm signature. As he told his cabinet, if I'm remembered for anything, I will be remembered for this. And so he sent a servant down to get some ice, and for 20 or 30 minutes, he iced his hand. He iced his fingers so that he could get a good signature. If I'm remembered for anything, it will be for this. And I don't want people to think 155 years later, today if you will, that at the end I flinched. At the end I wasn't sure. At the end I hesitated. And we're talking about expropriating $4 billion of private property. I mean, slaves were property, we know that. A wagon, a horse, a cow. That's something the Bolsheviks did at the end of the Russian Revolution. And he did it. And he signed it, henceforth and forever free. And the reason he signed the Emancipation Proclamation, I'm going to give you a number of reasons. One was this, that for a very practical way, in a political way, in a military way, there was no program. I mean, there was no directive from the office of the president as to what to do with runaway slaves. You see, when African Americans heard the boom of Union artillery, they ran into Union lines, and they didn't know what would happen after that. But there was no policy. Some of the commanders refused to accept the people running into their lines and sent them back. Others did. Ben Butler of Massachusetts, he did. He received these folks into his lines and put them to work, digging roads, burying the dead, tending to the wounded, or restringing telegraph wires. But there was no policy. So Lincoln wished, one, to have a policy. Secondly, he knew this, that if black Americans knew that if they ran into Union lines, they would be henceforth and forever free, that would force white men to put down their rifles, serving in Confederate lines, and go back home and do the planting, do the harvesting. It would be a war measure, you see. It would be a war measure to deny the South the manpower of white soldiers because their women can't do this work. And so it's a manpower need as well. And also, shortly after that, to invite black Americans to enlist in the United States Army, in the Navy, and so forth. And also, thirdly, and I always like to make this point, that Lincoln freed himself as well. See, he opposed slavery morally, economically. But I did not want to use the war to free black Americans. But it's a war measure. It's a war measure, an executive order from the desk of the president to affect the war-making capability of the Confederacy, to free himself, that I've been opposed to this morally, and to give direction to his commanders in the field, henceforth and forever free. They will not be returned. And if one reads the Emancipation Proclamation, it's quite disappointing, particularly when we have those soaring words of Lincoln at the Gettysburg Address, those memorable words. And also, another prayer from Father Abraham, and that's the second inaugural in March of 1865. And here's a man who was such a gifted craftsman with words that when one reads the Emancipation Proclamation, it reads like a bill of lading, because it carefully delineates, and here's the fourth point, it carefully delineates where the Emancipation Proclamation will take effect and where it will not. It does not take effect. It is not applicable to the 4 slave states that remained in the Union: Missouri, Delaware, Maryland, and Kentucky. You know, they were absented from that. Why? Lincoln did not want them to bolt the Union. Lincoln always said, I hope that God is on my side, but I have to have Kentucky. So he exempted them from this initially, or at least for the time being. But he told the governors of these states, it's coming. I mean, wars have momentum. It is coming. And he offered them a package, a compensatory package, that the federal government would buy back the freedom of slaves in Kentucky, Missouri, Delaware, and Maryland for $300 a head. And that's the number that had been used to buy back the freedom of slaves in the District of Columbia, where the federal writ ran. And now they have elected representatives, don't they? So there was the number, $300. And they balked and balked and balked. Absolutely not. And Lincoln said, it's coming. So it only took effect in those slave states still in rebellion. It did not take effect in slave states that had not left the Union. And another reason, that Lincoln wrote such a bland statement, that he did not want to be emotional. I'm doing this because it's the moral thing to do. I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do. Because he feared after the war that it might be challenged in court. You expropriated all this private property without due process, that no one should be denied life, liberty, or property without due process of law, that it might be grounds for legal action if he said, I did it because it's the right thing to do, emotionally. No. It is to end an insurrection. It's to end the rebellion. So it's on the books by an executive order, which, and hold this thought because it's part of him, it's part of Lincoln supporting the 13th Amendment, that an executive order then and today, only has the power of a president's decision. Now, it can be overturned today by a court and by Congress. But Lincoln knew that an executive order only has the authority of my signature, and another president at another time could reverse the executive order. Lincoln was a bright guy, and Lincoln's playing a chess game on 3 boards at the same time. I'm trying to solve 3 or 4 different problems simultaneously. And the war continues. And in 1863, in the aftermath of the Emancipation Proclamation, there are draft riots. In Boston, there was a draft riot. In other towns, in other cities as well. There was a huge draft riot in New York. And the beating and the lynching of free blacks in New York, a huge draft riot, that we are not white men. We are not going to report for induction, or we are not going to volunteer. This, we thought, was a war to restore the Union, not to free black men and women, because they'll be showing up here and take my job, and they'll be living next to us, and they'll be chasing our women. I saw you down there in the corner. Now, you can't hide well, you know that. Okay, not that you were trying to, but I spotted you, all right? So there were draft riots around the country, and an enormous draft riot in New York. The day Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, the stock market collapsed. That this is a whole new direction for the war. That we volunteered, we enlisted to save the Union. But now, in January of 1863, Union armies are marching into the Confederacy, not only to restore the Union, but also as armies of liberation, aren't they? And that's the fact of the matter on the ground. And that practice, again, was begun by a homebody, Ben Butler. I am not sending these men and women back. I'm going to use them in the field. And the very first job he gave them, build a brick oven and make bread for the troops. And then the other jobs, fell in after that. In 1863, we also have Lee. Lee will move into the North, with the Army of Northern Virginia. And, we all think that, well, let me hold that thought for a minute. And in May and June, in May of 1863, there's a meeting, an emergency meeting, a meeting in Richmond. And the captains are there, the generals are there, Davis is there. And the question is, where do we go in 1863, now that the fighting season has begun? I mean, for the most part, armies went into semi-retirement during the winter and in the rainy season. And they went into winter quarters. Not entirely, that's beginning to diminish. But with the warm weather, and the roads now being passable and marchable, if you will, what are our priorities here in 1863? Where do we go? And the consensus was, take the war west. Take it west. Maybe good things can happen in the west. By that I mean west of the Appalachian Mountains, to recover, to protect Kentucky. I mean, Kentucky was so divided during the war that maybe if there's a strong Confederate presence in a Kentucky, in a Missouri, that might pull them in. And if we can have a victory on Union soil, maybe Maryland will join as well. And the only reason that Maryland did not call in the legislature to vote to remain in the Union or not in the Union is that the governor of Maryland was a Unionist. And he knew that if he called the Maryland legislature into session to discuss whether to remain in the Union or secede, he would lose that vote. And he was a Lincoln guy. And Lincoln thanked him for that, because I know I'm going to lose that vote. And that means I'm going to have to move the capital, because Washington, D.C. is surrounded on three sides by Maryland. And so there's all sorts of pieces that are part of this conversation, part of Lincoln's thinking here. Lee. And Lee has such cachet. Lee, it seemed as if Lee and that Army of Northern Virginia were invincible. And Lee turned the conversation around. So that's not the way to look at things. That we need to take the Army east. I need to regroup, reposition, reprovision, the Army of Northern Virginia and take it back into the North. Good things may happen. Lee read the Northern press. He knew there were draft riots. He knew that morale was low, that the fatalities were awful. It even bothered Mary that there were so many grieving families. I should say even, that there were so many grieving families north and later on south as well. And if I can take the Army into the North and have a great victory on Union soil, maybe a number of good things could happen. Lincoln might sue for peace because there's such a lack of support, lack of morale for the war. Lee, maybe foreign recognition will come. They're always hopeful that Great Britain would recognize the Confederacy, and maybe France as well. And that would bring money and troops and a navy and break the Union blockade. So if I can defeat a Union army on northern soil, good things can happen. So as Lee gathered the army, and Jeb Stuart sent north, hold that name. Jeb Stuart was Lincoln's eyes and ears. He was the best scout, north or south, and he's going to let Lee down. accidentally. And as Lee moved north, and the goal was, the hope was, he wasn't quite sure. Lee was an opportunist to see, what developed. I need to meet a Union army somewhere in the field and defeat them and have a great strategic victory. And he was thinking about menacing Philadelphia. And he was thinking about perhaps menacing Harrisburg, perhaps menacing the very capital itself. The point was to draw out a Union army and destroy it in the field. And maybe good things could come from that. And Lee always knew this. Lee knew this from the outbreak of the war, that we need, if we're going to win and establish the Confederacy, we need a quick victory. We lose a long war. Lincoln talked about the arithmetic of the thing. And by that he meant not just manpower. He meant railroad track and munitions factories and everything that went into making war. The arithmetic of the thing. The North has more of everything. And now we're 2 years into the war. And we came so close. We came so close. Not that he was there, but we came so close at first Bull Run. We talked about that. Jeb Stuart is off. Jeb Stuart with his cavalry. Now, when I say cavalry, he's got 1,000 riders with him. This is a raiding party as well. And one thing about Jeb Stuart, boy, he liked reading the headlines about himself. He was such a ladies' man, dashing with his, with the hat on, with the big feather, and the long leather coat, and God knows how many weapons he had fastened to his pommel of his saddle. But he was glamorous, he was daring, he was beautiful, he was catnip to women. I always like to use that whenever I can. And the women swooned over him when he was around. And he liked reading his press releases. So he's up scouting for Lee. He is Lee's eyes and ears. Where is the Union Army? And General Meade, who was the 4th commander of the Army of the Potomac, maybe the 5th, in a year, was new to command. And unsure of himself. He's new to command. And he has an army almost twice the size of Lee's army, but you're new to command. And he was unsure of himself. And one reason that Lincoln chose Meade is that Meade was a Pennsylvanian. And now that Lee's in Pennsylvania, it might give him a little more iron in his spine. So if my hand is the Blue Ridge Mountain, the Blue Ridge Mountains. Lee's moving up this side of the Blue Ridge Mountains, looking for Meade is coming up this side of the Blue Ridge Mountain, and Lee does not know that Meade is right there. He doesn't know it, and he keeps waiting for Jeb Stuart to come back. And he is so dependent on Stuart. If the enemy is near me, he will be here to tell me. Where is Stuart? Where is Stuart? There must not be any danger. The problem is that Jeb Stuart got blocked, that Meade's army was so strung out that all the passes through the Blue Ridge for Stuart to cut through to the other side and tell Lee, they're there, they're over there, get the high ground now. Lee stumbled in to Meade at the Battle of Gettysburg. It was an accidental battle. But as Lee said, they're here and we're here, and we're going to engage the enemy now. And Lee also wanted to end this thing. Again, it's the arithmetic of the thing. And he wasn't feeling well. Lee was suffering from chest pain. I'm not well. I mean, no one knew he was having, I'm not well. I want to end this thing. And I want to force it. I want to force an ending to it. I'm not well. I have the loyalty of my men, the arithmetic of the thing, and the Union has the high ground at Gettysburg. We could do an entire 4 or 5 days, 4 or 5 hours, just on Gettysburg. And to be able to, diagram and, well, we don't have a map, but the movement of the troops and who was here, who was there, and so forth. Lee almost had it on the first day. Lee almost had it. The man who commanded the division that swept into Gettysburg, even before Lee was on the field, Jubal Early. Jubal Early was a fighter.
But he wasn't Stonewall Jackson. You see, Stonewall Jackson had gone down at Chancellorsville. Lee's his left-hand man, his right-hand man, was Pete Longstreet and Stonewall Jackson. And the three of these men anticipated each other, that I can read your mind. And Lee always gave general orders to Longstreet and to Stonewall Jackson. And here's the word he would use. And we don't use this word today. If practicable, I can't even pronounce it. If practicable to do this, do that. If in your judgment you can carry the day. You're there on the ground, I'm not. And as I said, the Longstreet's replacement was new to command, too. He wasn't sure of himself. Didn't know his guys. Didn't know how far he could push them. Wasn't sure about his colonels and his lieutenant colonels. And it's like when you become a new coach or manager. You're not quite sure, what your guys can do for you or how far you can push them. Where is their loyalty? And so Lee almost pulled it off on the first day, but he wasn't there. He came up that night. The enemy is there. We're attacking. And we have a 3-day battle, don't we? And it will be Longstreet, long after the war, who Longstreet will be blamed for having, back then, the slows at Gettysburg. Lincoln wanted Longstreet to move quickly on the third day, and Longstreet demurred. Longstreet, there's too much artillery up there. There's too much Union up there on that hill. And Longstreet and Lee went at it. And that is to say that Longstreet wanted to pull back and attack, threaten the capital, get the high ground, and make Meade attack him. You see, you can defend high ground much better than you can defend the low ground. And we've always done well if we have the high ground and shooting down at the enemy, and they're coming up at us. Read Antietam there. Think Antietam. And Longstreet, let's pull back, menace the capital, find the high ground, and Lincoln will burn up the telegraph wires to get Meade here, and we will destroy him. And Lee said, no, the enemy is there, and we're attacking tomorrow morning there. And Longstreet didn't believe in there. And long after the war, the lost cause, so many people pinned it on Pete Longstreet because he simply didn't move quick enough. He didn't believe in the plan. He didn't attack at daybreak. It was much, much later in the morning. And so that's one of the legacies of the lost cause in the memory of Pete Longstreet. And not only that, that Longstreet after the war joined the Republican Party. You just don't do that. And they're all Democrats down there. And that Longstreet, perhaps it was best that the Union was preserved. So there was a great deal that went into blaming Longstreet. We can't blame Lee. I mean, cannot blame Lee. Lee was the Teflon Confederate general, and he still is today. So at the end of 3 days, Pickett's charge, when Lee ordered Pickett's charge, Longstreet said, Longstreet, I see it already, General Lee. It's going to be a disaster. These 15,000 men, charging uphill almost a mile in an open cornfield with no cover. They're going to be cut down by Union musketry and by the canister, by the shrapnel. It'll be a slaughter. And it was. It should be called Lee's charge, not Pickett's charge. And Pickett believed that he was, Pickett had brought up the tail end of he was at the back of the Confederate Army, and he was bringing up the rear, his division. And he could hear the fighting and hear the fighting. I'm going to miss it. I'm going to miss it. And the fact that it was on July 4th resonated with Lee, the irony that we will achieve our independence on Independence Day, July 4th. We are charging that hill. I attack to the left. I attack to the right. Meade will have strengthened the left. He will have strengthened the right. The center will be weak. We're going right up the center, just like a quarterback sneak. But there was no football back then. And it was Lee's charge, Pickett's charge. It was a disaster. And when Pickett's division rolled back and fell back, after the charge, bloodied, and Lee riding out to stop the retreat, to stop the running, to stop the running. And riding out on Traveler on his horse and drawing his sword and putting his hat on the sword, rally on me, rally on me, rally on me, to stem the retreat, to stem the running away. And Lee's out here, General Lee to the rear, General Lee to the rear, rally on me, George, reform, George Pickett, George, reform your division, General Lee, I have no division. And he didn't. They were all bleeding and dying and gasping in that cornfield somewhere. I have no division. And that day resonated and reverberated for decades and decades and decades. It still does. I mean, the Gettysburg is the most visited battlefield of the Civil War. And many historians, incorrectly, and it still gets taught today incorrectly, that they see Gettysburg as the tipping point of the war. That is to say that everything was tipping toward that so much was tipping toward the Confederacy, and then after July 1863, it was tipping the other way. Lincoln didn't know that. Lincoln didn't believe that at all. But oftentimes, Gettysburg gets taught as the turning point, the tipping point. That's not correct, Brockton. There's still 2 more years of war left. Still 2 more years of war left. Lee's army was not totally routed. It retreated across the swollen Potomac and regrouped and reformed. And Meade did not chase Lee because he's more dangerous wounded, cornered, than he is at full strength. So Meade allowed Lee to ghost that army across the Potomac. 2 more years of war. And yet today, as I said, most people believe it's a tipping point. I mean, after all, Lee never came north again. Well, we know that today. They didn't know that. Lincoln never sued for peace. We know that. Lee didn't know that was going to happen. And it must be the most important battlefield. I mean, after all, it's the most visited battlefield, and it's where Lincoln came to deliver those remarks. That wonderful sermon, that wonderful epistle, Father Abraham to the American people. So it must be the tipping point. It must be the most important part of the war. Well, it was not. Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. If I could give you, here's your homework. You want some homework? I'll give you some. You got it, okay. You're going to get nailed right here. I'm going to give you some homework. Call up the program for the dedication of the Gettysburg Cemetery. There's the scheduled events, the program of events, and open it up, kind of. Open it up, and you'll see that the Reverend Stockton of the Senate, the chaplain of the Senate, is going to issue the opening remarks and the benediction, if you're the blessing. And then if you run your finger down, next to the phrase Gettysburg Address, is the name Edward Everett. Let me say it again. Next to the phrase Gettysburg Address is the name Edward Everett of Massachusetts. Edward Everett had been governor. Edward Everett had been ambassador to Great Britain. Edward Everett had been president of Harvard College. And everybody knew the name Edward Everett. And his skill, he had the voice, the diction, the pacing, dedicating monuments, dedicating battlefields. He dedicated the monument at the Old North Bridge. I think he dedicated Plymouth Rock. He had the voice, the pace, the diction, and he sounded like a megaphone. I mean, his voice could carry. And Ed Everett was invited to sweeten the poison air of Gettysburg. They asked John Greenleaf Whittier. He said, "I'm busy." William Cullen Bryant, "I'm busy." They asked Longfellow, "I'm busy." So they asked Everett in August or September to come and sweeten the poison air. Because by now, the air of Gettysburg was filled with the rotting smell of horse flesh, mule flesh, human flesh. And it was simply no longer possible or feasible to identify the dead. It was putrefaction in that hot southern heat of southern Pennsylvania. And the dead were rotting and stinking and coming apart at the seams. We cannot identify the dead and send them back home. We need to bury them here. So the decision was to turn it into a national cemetery, and as best as possible to be able to identify New York men, Massachusetts men, Michigan men, and bury them together in a semicircle. And we need to dedicate it. So they asked Ed Everett. And then the committee putting this together, someone made the necessary observation. These are all Union soldiers. Lincoln is the commander-in-chief. I think he should be asked to speak here. And the committee barked at each other over that. No. Do you know why? Because he will politicize this event. He will use it to announce his re-election campaign in November. The Gettysburg Address is November 19th, 1863. If we invite Lincoln, he's such a politician that he will use this as an opportunity to announce his interest for re-election. No, this is solemn, reverential. This is sacred. We're not going to politicize this. And they talked about this. They argued about this. Then they came up with a compromise. This is beautiful. I think it is. It's backfired on them. We cannot not invite Lincoln. It's just, we cannot not invite him. It's too rude. Here's what we'll do, though. We'll invite him 2 weeks before the ceremony. And as a president, his calendar is so full, he'll have to respectfully decline. That's how they tried to bag that one. I always tell people, I'm going to tell you as well, all right, that when you get a wedding invitation and it's 3 weeks before the wedding, you know that you are on the C list, don't you? You're not on the B list. You were never on the A list. You're on no list. You're on no list. So don't even respond. Make them guess. And Lincoln, to the consternation of the committee, accepted. He's coming. He's going to politicize this event, and he's going to tell those awful jokes that he tells. It will not be dignified at all. Lincoln had been looking for an opportunity to speak about the meaning of the war, something beyond interviews with editors, something beyond messages to Congress. I want to speak about the meaning of the war. And he said, I know that the families of those men who had fallen at the Battle of Gettysburg, they will be there. My brother died on that battlefield, if you will, my son, my husband, my neighbor. The families will be there, thousands of them. And I want to use this opportunity to talk about the meaning of the war. And Lincoln put together in 272 words the most memorable epistle in American history. We all know it. And a long time ago in a far and distant galaxy, when we had an elocution class, that you had to memorize a speech or a soliloquy from Hamlet or a poem by Robert Frost that hardly mattered, and you had to stand in front of your classmates and to make eye contact and speak slowly and deliberately and clearly, voice, pace, and diction. Never happens today. It does not happen today. The best you're going to get, I do a little classroom supervision, the best you're going to get is someone reading something, but to stand there in front of your classmates and speak, speak as if you're Abraham Lincoln with voice, pace, and diction and pausing, or just to do stand-up comedy. I mean, sometimes you can get a funny fourth grader, who I've seen this done, who can deliver one-liners. You have to have a gift to do that. Humor is the worst thing, the most difficult thing to do. It really is, particularly when you have to explain to someone why it's funny after you've told the joke. That's so annoying, isn't it? It is for me anyway. You don't know why that's funny, do you? What do you mean? You don't get it? In any event. Lincoln did not write the Gettysburg Address. I'll use the phrase. Oh, by the way, since you've got that program for the day out, next to Lincoln's name is Remarks. Not the Gettysburg Address, Remarks. Keep it short, to the point, why did he accept the invitation? He's going to spoil everything. Lincoln did not write the Gettysburg Address on the back of an envelope on the 80-mile train ride from D.C. to Gettysburg. Lincoln would never have left something that important to the very last minute. He wanted to speak about the meaning of the war. What were the ideals? We'll use the word son. You know, what were the ideals that your son died for? Does his death have meaning? Does his death have purpose? And what is our responsibility to the living? You know, to those who are buried today, this battlefield which we are consecrating, far above our poor power to add or to subtract. Your son, your brother, your husband has blessed this field, has sanctified this field far more than my humble power to do so, or our power together. And he put it together piece by piece by piece. Lincoln wrote it in his head. And by that I mean, he wrote little ideas down on scraps of paper. I know we do this sometimes. You know, that if I'm thinking about, I spoke on Sunday in Stoughton on Veterans Day, you know, and I spoke outside. What a mistake. I thought I was inside. It was so cold, so windy, and I had a suit on. I was absolutely stiff as a board. But I didn't write anything down. I did it in my head. And I had it put together in my head. Lincoln, an idea, an idea, an idea, an idea. And he took those scraps and he put them together. What he was reading on the train was he was responding to messages from the front, keeping in touch with his generals. And on that 80-mile train ride, he's got side sways. I mean, it's going here, and people coming in, Mr. President, Mr. President. So he buttoned it up the night before, and he had his Secretary of State who accompanied him, William Seward. Mary didn't want to go. The children were sick again, and she was so fearful that the fevers might claim the children. And Mary said no. And the only cabinet member, there were two, and Lincoln's personal friend now, the man whom he beat out, we talked about this the last time for the nomination, William Seward, Secretary of State. He had Seward look it over. And Seward made a couple of perfunctory changes. And Lincoln, the Gettysburg Address, they are a rifle salute to the dead. The Gettysburg Address, the right words at the right place at the right time. And when Ed Everett was finished speaking, and he gave the people the speech they wanted, he went on for 2.5 hours. It was a rock concert, and that's what people expected. And when Seward accepted the invitation to speak in September, he said, I can't be ready till the end of November. I need to visit the battlefield. I need to walk it. I need to smell it, literally. I need to feel it beneath the soles of my boots. I need to know where that unit was, and that unit was, and that unit was. And where's the little round top, the big round top? Where's Cemetery Hill? Which generals were in charge here, 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 and here? I want to speak to the moment. And I'm going to give you 2.5 hours. And boy, he gave them everything that they came for. And then after 2.5 hours of sitting, everybody got up and went to the bathroom. I mean, that's like a 9-inning baseball game. Well, it used to be 2.5 hours. Now it's 4 days. You know? And everybody got up and left. You know, they got up to stretch. They went to the bathroom. There were sutlers, and I'm spelling that Sutlers, who were selling sweet drinks and sweet cakes and souvenirs from the battlefield. You know, it's like tailgating. They were on the circumference, on the periphery of the battlefield. And people went up and got a Coke and a hamburger, I don't know. Other guy said, I'm going to use the porta potty. Who's speaking next? I don't know, but I got to stretch. And when Ed Everett got through, Lincoln got up and he spoke. He was done in under 3 minutes. It's the most memorable address in American history. And the way he laid it out, birth, death, rebirth. 77, datable. When this nation, he no longer used the word union. A union is a constellation of states, that we are a nation of hearts and minds. And we are saving the work of the Founding Fathers, beginning in 1776. It is datable, 1776, 77. Who? Our fathers, where? On this continent. Purpose, conceived in liberty, birth, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. That's a oblique reference to the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln at Gettysburg did not attack the South for slavery, for secession, for the war. He did not mention where he was. He did not mention any part of the battlefield. He did not mention any general. As I said, he did not attack the Confederacy. I need to govern these people afterwards, and I cannot govern them by attacking them. And he did not come and chortle and claim victory. He knew there was a great deal of hard fighting yet to come. So 77. And in the middle, talking about, we honor, we dedicate this film, this land here. And he offered living family members. And this is a sweet way to put it. Let's say your son died from Ohio. And he said, your son, he didn't say your son. He said, these men did not lose their lives. They gave their lives that the nation might live. And that's a different nuance, isn't it? They did not lose. They gave their lives that the nation might live. And that's part of that was part of what I reminded folks when I spoke on Veterans Day. And it was cold. It was cold. Nice turnout, though. And then Lincoln asking the rhetorical question, what is our responsibility? The living. What is our responsibility? That from these honored dead we take increased devotion. And that Lincoln, rebirth, and that government of the people. When folks read the Gettysburg Address, most folks read it incorrectly. They emphasize the preposition. They read it this way, of the people, by the people. That's not correct. I was there. That's not how Lincoln did it. That's not how he laid it out there. He emphasized the collective noun, people. He's going back to the beginning. The first three words of the Constitution, the gift of the Revolution, the gift of the Founding Fathers. We, the people. And Lincoln read it, the government of the people. Well, the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish. That's a commandment, isn't it? Shall not. That's the Decalogue. That's Moses coming down from I almost said Mount Vernon, Mount Sinai. Washington was a Moses in some ways. But that's the Decalogue. Shall not perish. Living organisms perish. He could have said, shall not disappear, shall not dissolve, shall not perish. He picked his words carefully. Of those 72 words, all but no more than 8 or 9 have 3 syllables. It's to the point, pinning words, this, that, and so forth. And that's Lincoln. And it was just a smattering of applause. No one was there. They're still online, waiting to use the bathroom. Or I'm waiting for my Coke. Where's my Coke? And those few people that were there, did Lincoln speak yet? I'm a reporter for the New York Tribune. Did Lincoln speak yet? Yes, he's finished. What do you mean he's finished? He's done. I just left 5 minutes. He's done? He's done. What did he say? I don't know. He's done. Ed Everett knew. When it was done, Ed Everett went over to Lincoln and said, you have done in 3 minutes what I could not do in 2.5 hours. May I have a copy? And Lincoln punched out a copy for him. Lincoln thought he had failed. When Lincoln sat down, he leaned into his personal bodyguard, Ward Hill Layman, and he said, Layman, that speech won't scour, S-C-O-U-R. Now, we used that word because he had been a farmer, and a plow, a blade that won't scour, won't cut the thick soil of a Kentucky or an Illinois. It cannot cut it. No, it made no dent. It left no impression. Hill, that speech won't scour. No one will remember it. We do today. The Democratic press dismissed it in 3 words. They dismissed Lincoln's Gettysburg remarks in 3 words. Silly, I'm not making this up. These are the silly, flat, and dishwatery. It's the most remembered address in American history, isn't it? They did not lose their lives. They gave their lives. And then Lincoln was done. And Lincoln took the train. He wasn't feeling well after that. And he just wasn't feeling well, period. And he took the train back to Washington. And the war continues, doesn't it? And Lincoln, in December of 1863, began to give voice to his thoughts as to what Reconstruction should look like. I mean, that's the name he gave to how do we reconstruct, how do we restore the Union? And what will be the conditions, what will be the terms that the defeated Confederate states must meet to get into the Union? One, to be restored to the Union, one by one by one. And it was very generous and quite simple. And as Lincoln looked at Reconstruction, both in December of 1863, and as he rethought it, that the words that the feelings that he brought to Reconstruction, the tone to Reconstruction that he brought to Reconstruction, that it be quick, it be compassionate, and non-retributive. In other words, there's not going to be firing squads and hangings. It'll be rapid. It'll be non-retributive. And I'm not going to ask folks to renounce secession. And it's called the 10% plan. That's what it was called, the 10% plan. And here's how it worked as Lincoln envisioned it. When 10% of a Confederate state that was now occupied by the Union Army, when 10% of the voters of that state who had voted in the 1860 election, because that's the last time there had been an election in which North and South participated. There's one coming up in 1864, but Confederate states, for the most part, there are no ballots being counted there. Florida, by the way, was still counting, and they're still counting in Florida. Want a little trivia? Tallahassee was the only Confederate capital not captured by Union forces. So that's what's the problem with Tallahassee, you see. So you can use that. That'll win you some money on a quiz show. Rapid, quick, rapid, compassionate, and non-retributive. When 10% of the voters from the 1860 election meet, just 10%, just a modicum, a small minimum, that they meet and write a state constitution. And that constitution, A, will accept the Emancipation Proclamation, that slavery is dead, accept the Emancipation Proclamation, and you pledge future loyalty to the government. I'm not asking you to apologize for the war. I'm not asking you to repeal your ordinances of secession, to pledge future loyalty, and that slavery is dead. And there may be a few leaders of your state, I'll give you Alabama, and that may need to appeal to me for a personal pardon. But other than that, he hoped that if 10% of the people of Alabama, I'm using Alabama as an example, that if they will see how mild this is and benign and compassionate, and if they can give up the war by getting back into the Union, without any punishment, no federal occupation. He did not ask that blacks be given the right to vote. None of that is there. Get back in the Union, and then we'll deal with the rest later on. And he hoped it would have a small snowball effect. That if Alabama took this, and the fighting stopped, and the bleeding stopped, and the dying stopped among the good people of Alabama, Mississippi will see that I'm keeping my word. And this will serve an example. Mississippi will give it up. And if Mississippi gives it up, maybe Louisiana will give it up. And it'll snowball, through the Confederacy. And this great, awful war will be over. My 10% plan. Mary didn't think it was tough enough. She was tough. Mary did not think it was tough enough. And she had 3 brothers who died fighting for the Confederacy. This isn't tough enough. Congress Congress did not think it was tough enough either. And Congress wanted a hand in implementing the policy for Reconstruction. You see, later on, and this is not on our watch, we know that Andrew Johnson, who will follow Lincoln to the presidency, that there will be a very sharp divide between what I call, and the way I lay it out there, between presidential Reconstruction and congressional Reconstruction. Very sharp divide, which becomes quite divisive and approaching impeachment, you see. And Lincoln knew that Congress would be out there, and Congress responded. And Congress responded with what's called the Wade-Davis bill. And since there's no exam, you don't need to write anything down. So look at it as Congress is throwing its hat in the ring. They're firing a shot across Lincoln's bow. We're involved as well here. Don't try to elbow us out. We are proposing a Wade-Davis bill, in which 50% of the voters, let's stick with Alabama, 50% of the voters have to write a new constitution, in which they accept that slavery is dead, and they need to apologize. They need to do a mea culpa through my fault. That's the only Catholicism I know. For starting this war, and there will be punishment for those who are responsible for it. And that Wade-Davis bill, hear me well here, this is Lincoln, astute, the politician. That Wade-Davis bill landed on Lincoln's desk 10 days, no, it landed on Lincoln's desk right before Congress was to adjourn. And if you read your Constitution, and you know I always carry one with me, you know that, that the president, when Congress puts a bill on the president's desk, he has 10 days to look it over before he responds. And if the bill lands on his desk with fewer than 10 days, he does not have to respond. It's called a pocket veto. That's where it comes from. Now, not that he put it in his pocket, but it's a political phrase, isn't it? If I get that on day 7, I don't have to respond. I can just pocket veto. What he did say is that this is Congress's plan. I've read it over. This is my plan. And I think the good people of Alabama should be able to choose which plan they want, my plan or the Wade-Davis plan. And we'll get back to it with the next session of Congress. This is Lincoln. I'm not picking a fight with the Congress because I do not have to. They did not get it to my desk on time. I didn't have 10 days to look it over. I had 6 or 7. So I'm just going to stick it in my pocket. We'll talk about it later. Lincoln knew he would have trouble. But I'm not going to pick a fight now because I need to get reelected. And we haven't won the war yet. And remember, it's only December 1863, January 1864. Let me stop just for a minute, because as I always do, I fill the room with hot air, don't I? I always do that. And as I've said to you before, you've heard me say this, that Al Gore has not caught me yet. I am the source of global warming. It's me. It has nothing to do with carbon emissions. It's me. I have words in my head that I've never said. I have an unplayed Scrabble game in my head. I want to make sure I can turn every tile over before I go to the other side of the stars. So let me just stop for a minute. I'll catch my breath and I'll give you your voice. A question, an observation, maybe something I need to pin down a little bit deeper. This is 1863, Lincoln's pivotal year, and the election is coming. And in 1864, oh, this is good timing. This is good to set this up for a close. Anybody, what we're meeting? Does anybody know when we're meeting in December? I mean, the sheriff isn't here. She's probably down there practicing on the ukulele, trying to join this guy. That in 1864, in March of 1864, Lincoln brings General Grant to command. Grant had given Lincoln victories in the West, where nothing good was supposed to happen. All the big battles would be in the East. and we talked about this before, that the Axis, the Battle of Axis would be between Washington, D.C. and Richmond, 125 miles away. That would dictate the war, and the war would be won or maybe lost in the East. And Lee is the big guy there. But Grant, Grant had provided victories, to Fort Henry, Fort Donelson, Vicksburg, which fell on the very day that Lee pulled out of Gettysburg, and that the whole Mississippi River now is wide open for federal penetration, so they can go down the Mississippi and land troops on the east and west banks of the Mississippi River. We often tend to forget that Vicksburg and Gettysburg are linked. That is a huge turning point, Vicksburg, more so than Gettysburg. But it gets overlooked because it's out there somewhere. And we're so parochial here in Massachusetts that if it didn't happen here, it doesn't matter. I mean, after all, the whole thing started here, didn't it? I mean, you guys can have your non-history. Vicksburg. Lincoln knew. And Lincoln brought Grant to command. Once he had checked him out, the stories on his drinking, and he had sent out a spy, eyes and ears, and the drinking issue. And Grant drank. He drank when, during that peacetime army, in some godforsaken place up in the Pacific Northwest, where there was nothing for the guys to do except drink, fight, and play cards. And Grant missed his wife. He missed Julia. Imagine that. He liked his wife. He missed his wife. He missed his children. And he really liked about her that she was cross-eyed. No, he really did. He found that amusing. I'm not making that up. One more minute. When Grant and Julia went to the White House, that she stumbled over furniture because her depth perception was off. She was cross-eyed. And there were surgeons, ophthalmologists in D.C. who said, we think we can correct this. And Grant said, no, I love you just the way you are, the way you stumble over stuff. So on a receiving line, since she didn't have depth perception and she's shaking hands with you, she might put her hand right into your stomach or into your throat because the depth perception was off. That never gets in the history books. That's a little bit of something extra for you. Can you imagine? Darling, I love you just the way you are. Would you walk over there and get the coffee pot? I can watch you navigate. Navigate. Lincoln brings Grant to command in March of 1864. Grant doesn't want it. I don't want to go to Washington. All the politics, all the backbiting, all the infighting. I do not want to go to Washington. I want to stay here in the field. I want to stay here in the field and win my war in the West. And Sherman, Uncle Billy Sherman, asked Grant, please don't go. I rely on you. I rely on you. And Grant told Sherman that if you ever get in trouble, I will be there. I will find you. Take heart. I'm going to Washington, but I will come to your relief if you get in trouble. And Sherman's on his own now, of course, and we'll talk just a little bit about that next month. So Grant accepts the position on this condition, that I want to be in the field. I do not want to be a desk general. I do not want all the political pressures, social pressures of Washington. I want to be in the field. And Lincoln to Grant, when you are in the saddle, General, you are the Union. You will be a field commander, and those are his words. When you are in the saddle, when you will be, you are in the saddle, and you will be the commander. Just keep me informed. Where are you? What's up? I want to know where you are. When you're in the saddle, you are the Union. And Grant takes command, and it is a bloodbath. Butcher Grant, and Mary Lincoln relieve him of command. Relieve him of command. Remember, we said she always called him Lincoln. And he later on began calling her mother. And whenever you call your wife mother, it's done. It's over. It's cooked.
pack it up and put it away. I'll see you later. Take care. All right, be well.